Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to EDEC Infra webinar. I'm Natalia Gaidorenko, and I am here with Darwin Marcelo, Project Director, and Xinyu Ho, Sustainability Data Analyst. Some of you may know that we are running a series of webinars this month where we present the work we have been developing on climate impacts and risk. And today we are looking at physical risk in green infrastructure investments. We have 1 hour, 45 minutes of which Darwin and Xinyu will talk you through the topics of the webinar, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please leave your questions in the Q&A sections and we will answer them after the presentation. And now over to you, Darwin.
Thank you, Natalia, and thank you everyone for being with us today. Let me start telling you about infraMetrics by EDEC Infra. First, infraMetrics has academic roots. infraMetrics is designed to produce analytics based on large representative samples and using academically validated approaches rooted in modern financial theory and economics. Moreover, infraMetrics has been created on the foundation of over a decade of research on unlisted infrastructure investments at the EDEC Business School. EDEC Infra provides market indices, benchmarks, valuation analytics for investors in unlisted infrastructure, including equity and private debt, asset owners, asset managers, pension funds, consultants, asset valuation professionals currently use our data sets. Our metrics track thousands of investments in 25 countries over the past 20 years. Moreover, our key indices gain recognition from ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Association. More recently, EDEC Infra embarked on a new ambitious project, the Green Infrastructure Project, as we call it, currently representing almost 3 years of work and several $1 million on research and development at EDEC Infra. The Green Infrastructure Project has a dedicated team of data scientists, experts on infrastructure and climate risk.
Darwin, we can't hear you. Xinyu, maybe you will take over from here.
At the asset level, our climate products are divided into 4 types of offerings. Transition risk exposure metrics. This was introduced by my colleague Fabian last week. Physical risk exposure metrics. That's the topic that we will be discussing today. Climate stress test metrics. This is the set of metrics that will be introduced in our webinar coming up next week, and data for reporting, which my colleague Nishta will be talking us through at the end of the month. Finally, I want to emphasize that infraMetrics, our unique data and analytics platform with the deepest available financial insights for unlisted infrastructure, will now include the green infrastructure metrics that I just mentioned above, right? So this is a big addition to the existing platform, and we hope that you have the opportunity to look at this information more in detail. Let me introduce my colleague Xinyu. She's a sustainability data scientist. She's specialized in physical risk-related research, data production at the EDEC Infra. Her background is in urban analytics, geographical information systems, and real estate. About myself, I'm Darwin Marcelo. I'm the project director of the Green Infrastructure Project. Before, I was with the World Bank as the program manager of the Quality Infrastructure Investment Partnership and as the lead of the Global Infrastructure Connectivity Alliance, GICA. I leave you now with my colleague Xinyu, who is going to walk you through the work that we've been doing on physical risk. Xinyu, welcome.
Thank you. All right. So earlier on, I think we experienced a minor technical hiccup. where I think Darwin, it froze for a little bit while we were presenting, and we caught you back halfway. So as I go along this presentation, if at any point in time I froze, please feel free to come back and let me know. Darwin and Natalia, I'm happy to repeat any slides that I have covered or miscovered. All right, so thank you. It's a great honor here today to be able to present to you all the work that we've been doing, all the research work on physical risk, as well as by my team. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the landing page of infraMetrics. So this is what you'll see when you first log into our infraMetrics. And I'd like to highlight here that infraMetrics is more than just a platform for data visualization. Yes, you can access infraMetrics to get access to some of the benchmarks that we keep, and as well as the market indices that AdHack Infra provides. You can also use it to see some comparables between some deals. And more importantly, infraMetrics is a repository for a lot of the research work, papers, as well as data that we've been doing over the years. But what we are most excited to share with everybody today is actually this beta tab where you see my laser pointer is at. So this is where you can find the latest climate metrics data, as well as the physical risk data that we'll be talking a lot about today in the webinar. So before I go into the nitty-gritty details of what is physical risk and what have we done, I'd like to take a step back and bring us through the foundation of all the work that we've been doing, which is TICS. So the concept of TICS is actually industrial standard benchmark infrastructure investment classification and benchmark system that AdHack Infra has come up with, is reviewed by a panel of professionals every year. And essentially what TICS does is that it takes all the infrastructure assets in the world, and then they classify it into 8 industrial asset superclasses. So from IC10, from the likes of power, renewables, power generators and renewables, to IC80, such as network utilities. And within these 8 industrial superclasses, we further subdivided it into 101 asset subclasses. So for example, IC60 is the superclass for transport. And within transport itself, is subdivided into many different types of asset classes. So including the likes of IC60-1010, which is commonly referred to by us and TICS as airports. So throughout this webinar, you'll hear us constantly referring back to TICS because it is the foundation. And this is where it gets interesting, because when you have all the data that we have prepared and calculated, it gets interesting when you're able to compare it across different industrial superclasses and subclasses. That's where all the insights investors can come in and add value to the investment work that you're doing. So finally, we are very excited to share that climate risk data is finally available on infraMetrics for over 700 plus assets worldwide across all the superclasses. It is not the whole world we envision to eventually cover, but we think that is a good start and a good representation of the wider infrastructure world. And that let us get started on physical risk in infraMetrics. So at this point in time, I would like to introduce everybody, or rather define what is physical risk first in the first place. So every asset in the world is subjected to physical risk. And physical risk comes in the form of climatic weather hazard events, be it flood, storms, cyclones, wildfire, even heat waves, what have you. So these are brought about due to climate change. And every asset by existing might be subjected, will incur the risk of being affected by these hazard events, what we call physical risk hazard events. So all of them will incur a certain amount of physical risk. It might be damaged by the flood, for example. And here in AdHack Infra, we are in the business of quantifying physical risk. And in infraMetrics itself, we have kind of consolidated that into 4 main metrics that we think is easy to understand and meaningful for investors. These are what you see on the screen right now. And I'll be going through each one of them one by one with everybody now, slowly. So physical damage at risk, what we like to call PDAR, is essentially the estimated damage incurred by the asset due to the physical hazard event happening. And in order to come up with this estimated damage, what we need to first do is to acquire worldwide coverage of high resolution hazard models. So hazard, as what I mentioned, includes the likes of storms, cyclones, flood, wildfire, et cetera, et cetera. I will cover in detail which are the physical risks that we have later. But after acquiring that hazard models, we then applied scientific and robust climate modeling to help us process all this information, because it's a worldwide model. There's a lot of information. Therefore, we utilize big data and geospatial data analytics approaches to help us process the data. And afterwards, to translate all these hazard models into actual damage, we used damage functions. So I will go through all these in detail of how all these actually work in our data and methodology steps slides later on. But these are essentially what we do to come up with the PDAR value. So now the question is, what exact physical risk hazard do we actually cover in infraMetrics? So the answer is we cover 3 of the major physical risk events, which is flood, storm, and cyclone. We are currently doing work to include physical risk, and the work on this is currently ongoing. And we hope to go include that soon. So I would like to take this time here to slowly go through what we mean by 1%, 2%, and 3% probability of occurrence here. It takes a bit of explaining here, but it forms the foundation of all the values that we'll be referring to later on. So here, what we mean by 1%, 2%, and 3% is essentially equivalent to the magnitude of the physical risk event. So not only do we provide you the calculated estimated damage to flood, storm, and cyclone, we also do that for varying magnitudes of flood, storm, and cyclone risk events. So essentially, think of it simply as we have 3 types of magnitudes: bad, very bad, to really very bad. So the bad magnitude events are what we call 1 in 30-year physical risk event. Then the very bad is equivalent to 1 in 50-year physical risk event. Then the really very bad is equivalent to 1 in 100-year physical risk event. So example, what we see in the news, commonly we hear references of a 100-year flood, a 50-year flood, and a 30-year flood. And why do we normally refer to this physical risk event in such denominations? To understand this, we need to take a step back to understand how meteorologists actually quantify physical risk. So typically, physical risks are quantified when you have an asset and you need to know the probability of that event, of that physical risk happening. And to do that, they will use statistical model. In this case, do a probability distribution, and then thereafter, based on historical data. So often, when you have 100 years of historical data, you put it into a probability distribution. And then at that point where it is 1% of event happening, you point it to that 1%, and then where the corresponding magnitude is what we refer to as a 1 in 100-year event, which correspondingly have a 1% probability of occurrence. So the same is said for 1 in a 50 and 1 in a 30 year. It's based on 50 years of historical data, and it's at the point where it's 1 in a 50, which is 2% probability of occurrence at a corresponding magnitude. Same thing for 3%, which is a 1 in a 30-year physical risk event. So this is the foundation of the magnitude of the events that we're measuring in physical risk and infraMetrics. And with that done and out of the way, we can now move on to what are the metrics that we've calculated. So having calculated the physical damage at risk, which is the actual estimated damage to the asset, we are now able to match it with financials by tapping on into AdHack Infra's in-house expertise and repository of all the financial data that we have. So we match it together and translate it into actual financial impacts, potential financial impacts to the asset. And what's more, we have it at the asset level. Each asset will have this quantified financial values, and it's very granular. So again, we have it at different probability of occurrence. We also have it, meaning that we have it at different magnitude of the physical risk event. And with that, having calculated the value at risk, we are also able to calculate the expected loss of physical damage. This is after we factor into account the probability of the event actually happening. So for a 1 in 100-year event, we multiply it by 1% of it actually occurring at any point in time in a year, 2% for a 1 in a 50-year event, and 3% for a 1 in a 30-year event. So this gives us an expected value of loss that investors can refer to at any point in time. And with all these metrics calculated, we are now able to do a ranking of these assets in their subclasses, superclass and subclass, so that you are able to derive additional insights and compare to your industry peers. So these are the 4 metrics that we have in infraMetrics. And before I forget, it's a very important question that I think is on everybody's mind. What is the coverage of your data? Well, you have good data. Does it actually cover all the assets? And is it covering the whole world? So to assure you, yes, it covers all types of infrastructure asset in the TICS asset class. And we have over 500 of assets with physical risk data from 2019 onwards. And these are the examples of the infrastructure asset classes that we have. So all the way from gas power plant, coal power plant, other fossil fuel power plant, from power and renewables, all the way down to utilities from different transmission cables, electricity, gas, water, and sewage. We have assets in each of these, and this list is not exhaustive. We have a longer list. And more importantly, we also cover a wide geography distribution of over 23 countries in Europe, Americas, and Asia Pacific for this 500 assets data, 500 assets that we have. And now we move on to data methodology to explain how actually we derive those values. And let me introduce to you our 4-step climate modeling strategy. So as with anything physical risk, we are very location motivated. So firstly, we identify the location of the asset. So given the example of the Rose and Crown solar plant, what we first do is that we go to Google, we go to the company website, cross-check with the financial to find out that this company, where is it located? Then thereafter, we'll go to pinpoint the exact location on the map. In this case, it's in Norfolk, United Kingdom. After that, having the exact location on the map, we'll proceed to extract the geospatial shape on the map. And this is done with the help of automated tools that we've developed in-house, as well as many hours of manual checks and editing to ensure high accuracy of our data. After that is where we overlay the hazard models, the worldwide hazard models that we have. And in this example, you can see that this is a 1 in a 100-year flood event. So you can see the actual extent of the flood in the event of it actually happening. This is the proportion of the asset that will be affected by the flood. So the higher, darker blue portion is referring to higher water levels in the event of that flood happening. So far, I've only just covered the flood and the extent of the flood affecting the asset. It is not equivalent to damage incurred by the asset. So this is where the idea of damage function is very important and critical to our work. So I'm going to explain in detail what is damage function. So damage functions are essentially a model, a mathematical equation that takes in inputs and give us outputs, which in this case, the inputs is from the hazard model, such as in the case of flood, the level, the depth of the water level in the event of it happening. And then it gives us the output, which is the estimated damage incurred by the asset when it is faced with such a water level depth. And how this damage function is derived is actually based upon years and years of detailed empirical engineering research. And this is best exemplified by an example, best explained by an example. So for example, a damage function for a road. A damage function for a road is very sector specific, it's also very country specific for damage function in general. So a damage function for a road in Norway is going to be very different from a damage function for a road in Singapore and Malaysia. Firstly, due to climatic conditions, and also due to the typical construction materials used in Norway versus in Singapore. So in Norway, because of the mountainous region, they are normally not exposed to flood or high levels of water accumulation. So the damage function for road in Norway, actually, once the water level reaches a certain level of not very high, the threshold for water is not very high, the road will be damaged. Compared to Singapore, where we are built for the tropical rainstorms here, the tolerance for water accumulation is actually much higher. So the damage function for a Singapore road, on the other hand, has very high tolerance for water accumulation. So the point here is that damage functions are very sector and country specific, and these are done with years and years of research by other leading scientists in the field. And what we've done here in Infra is really look through all the available literature out there to study them and apply this damage function. And the output of this work that we've done is that we managed to find damage function and calculate damage factors for about 542 assets across all infrastructure sectors. So similarly, after we have calculated damage factors, we are then able to proceed with other calculations, such as our p-var calculations, by linking it with our financials, and calculate the expected loss after factoring in the probability of the event happening. So that sums up how we actually came up with the product as data and methodology. At this point in time, I'd like to take a sip of water. And I'd like to remind everybody that you can, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to type in the Q&A section. We will answer it at the end of segment 7 before we wrap the session up. So no worries, any point in time, if you have any questions, please feel free to type in the Q&A. And now let us move on to the most exciting part of this webinar, which is actually the use case. So use case to investors and how you can use our data in your investment work. So I present to you the first use case, which is climate comparables. There are many comparables that you can do. And the first one is by comparing across sector. So as mentioned before, because we have over 500 assets that covers all the sectors of infrastructure asset classes, we're able to do comparison using a variety of benchmarks. You can compare within the sector itself, even with industry subsector, in fact, by countries or by regional, all sorts of comparisons are possible, and you can use a variety of benchmarks using industrial, average, mean, median, even quartiles. It is customizable. You can do all kinds of comparison. And being able to do comparison, or what we call relativistic assessment of physical risk, can be very useful and even critical for making investment-informed decision. To make my case in point, we have a graph here where my laser pointer is. This is a box and plot graph. So here, I'll explain what we have on the x-axis and y-axis. So on the y-axis, the vertical axis here, we have a select example of 4 infrastructure superclass. So power generation, social infrastructure, transport, and renewables. And on the x-axis here, we have the worst damage incurred by the asset. And it's a combination of flood, storms, and cyclone, meaning all the physical risk. So this is the worst damage incurred based on the physical risk. So, for example, if you're an investor, you have an asset. Yes, you can look into the asset superclass itself and compare amongst your peers. So with a box plot, you're able to see that any points beyond the top whisker, these are all the outliers. You're able to see which are the outliers and how your asset compared to the outliers, and even against the industry average, median. But what's more interesting is when you start zooming it out, and you're able to compare across different sectors, superclass. And that's where you see that actually transport as a superclass is in generally higher exposed to have higher exposure to physical risk than all the other assets in the other subsectors. So here you can see that they have more outliers, and the outliers magnitude is higher. And at the same time, even the industry median, first quartile, and third quartile range is already higher than the rest of the superclass. So as an investor, then you can evaluate whether you're holding on to too much transport in your portfolio, for example, knowing that it is exposed to higher physical risk. So that's just the first layer of comparison that you can do. There is a second layer of comparison that you can do, and this is where we bring in linkage to the financial values that we have calculated. Additional insights can be gained. So again, let me explain the scatter plot that we have here. So on the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, we have here for 1 in 100 year flood risk, and it's value at risk. So it's calculated based on the value at risk for 1 in 100 year flood, and it's in USD millions of dollars. And on the x-axis, we have size of the asset in USD million of dollars. So it's the total asset size of the asset. So generally, if you have a lot of points scattered at the right-hand side of this scatter plot, it means that there is a lot of assets that has very huge asset size, and at the same time, they also have very high value at risk due to flood, where a lot of these value of the asset will be destroyed in the event of a 100-year flood happening. So the insight here is that if you look again, transport stands out together with power generation, which is the dirty yellow and red color. These assets are those that tend to have higher sunk costs, high investment costs due to the large asset size. At the same time, they are the most exposed to a flood risk. And the flood risk will basically wipe out a huge proportion of the value of the asset. Compared to assets such as renewables and environmental services, which is green and dark blue, they are mostly found at the zero portion, whereas there is no flood risk, where there's no flood value at risk, and with varying total asset size of the asset. So again, for an investor, the question then, it poses very interesting questions of if you want to invest in transport asset classes, for example, you might want to put in place safeguards to guard against flood risk and other types of physical risk appropriately to ensure that a lot of this value will not be at risk in the event of the actual flood actually happening, for example. So now onwards, the third dimension of comparison. This is where we spice things up and we add in another dimension of information. And here, I'd like to introduce everybody to transition risk. So transition risk and physical risk combined, when you sum it up, it is equivalent to climate risk. So I like to, at this point in time, I give a quick shout out to my colleague, Fabian. Last week, he gave a webinar on transition risk. So if anybody is interested, drop us an email. We're more than happy to send you related links with regards to the transition risk work done by my colleague, Fabian. I will not be going through the nitty-gritty details of what is transition risk, but in summary, transition risk are financial risks incurred when transiting to a lower carbon economy. And to transit to a lower carbon economy, you need to reduce the carbon emission. So generally, higher carbon emission means higher transition risk. So here, in this graph, I have on the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, predicted scope 1 and 2 carbon emission, which is representative of transition risk. And then right where my mouse is hovering above now, this red dotted dashed line is the mean of the transition risk of all the assets. And here's a distribution of the transition risk assets of all the assets. And then on the x-axis, where it's the horizontal, we have the calculated flood damage of a 100-year flood event. So where my mouse is, this is the mean of the flood risk, of the calculated flood risk damage to all the assets. So it gets really interesting because having explained that, we can divide this into 4 quarters, and that's where we have very interesting classification. So here at the top right-hand corner is where we call you have above average flood risk and above average transition risk. And hence, these belongs to the classification of higher climate risk. And here we have an example of a gas-fired power plant in the UK. So it belongs to the higher climate risk category. Then we move down to the lower quadrant, lower right quadrant. So here is where you have higher than average flood risk, but lower than average transition risk. So this is just a simple lower flood risk quadrant. And here we have an example of a motorway in Chile. Then if we move back up to the top left-hand quadrant, again, it's similar, where you have higher than average transition risk, but lower than average flood risk. So it's just a higher transition risk, example of a coal-fired power plant in Malaysia. And lastly, we move on to the fourth quadrant, bottom left-hand corner, what we call the better quadrant, where you have lower than average flood risk and lower than average climate risk, example of a sports center in France. So here, the point we're trying to make here is that even within the same asset superclass, such as power generators, you have here an example of a gas-fired power plant and a coal-fired power plant. Even within the same superclass, an asset can have different exposure to climate risk. And you can find that out using our data. And you can do more than this classification. This is just a use case. And this can help you to prioritize the assets in your portfolio, for example. So this is how data can help. And finally, if you're interested in asset level comparison, we also offer that and it's directly, this is a view that is from our infraMetrics platform itself. And so here, let me orientate everybody a little bit. We have already filtered all these assets to be from power generator superclass. And now what we have here is once we've filtered that, the platform automatically calculates for us the average physical risk according to flood, storm, and cyclone. And then you have the PDAR, PVAR, and expected loss calculation accordingly. So if you want to do an asset level comparison, you're able to do so very quickly. So here you're straight away able to tell which asset has an above average flood risk, as demonstrated here, this Germany power plant. And then in orange outline here, you have above average storm risk for all the power stations in Europe, followed by above average cyclone risk for this APEC coal plant in Philippines. So you're able to do asset by asset comparison down to the granular level. So with that, let me move on to the use case 2, and to highlight again that the beauty of our data is that you can go as granular as you like, as what I've demonstrated in this use case. And at the same time, immediately you can zoom out to have a macro view at the portfolio level without identifying all the physical risks line by line. So here you can straight away do a quick aggregation. So the example that we've chosen here is to aggregate by IC60 transport superclass. So straight away you can get an average PDAR and PVAR value, as well as all the max physical risk. And you can compare it with another equivalent comparable in the portfolio level, such as the Infra 300. So Infra 300 is a market index provided by AdHack. It actually tracks the revenue, quarterly revenue of the 300 unlisted infrastructure assets. So straight away, you can do a quick comparison on your physical risk exposure with these 300 companies and to see whether it's above average or below average. So with that, one more benefit of our data is that you can use infraMetrics physical risk data as inputs or proxy for relevant reporting requirements. So a very relevant one is is a good fit for TCFD, which is the short for Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. You can actually use our data as an input and as a proxy directly to some of these requirements that they recommend that you report in. So with that, now to the last part, how do you access infraMetrics? So once again, you are seeing this beautiful screen of the infraMetrics platform itself. Here is what you will see when you log in. What we've done previously is to extract zoomed in screenshot of it. But importantly, what I want to highlight here is that for climate related data, there are 3 tabs. What you see here in red, the baseline climate. And then you have one more for social, one more tab for social. And we have one more incoming tab for climate scenarios. So these are the 3 tabs for the climate risk, climate related data. And more importantly, when my mouse is hovering, you have the download button where you can actually download all our data with a click. And this is where I think it'll be useful to a lot of investors too. And finally, how to access infraMetrics. You can either Google AdHack Infra or you go straight to our website. Then you click on infraMetrics and click on this button to request access to the platform and fill in your details. Then our marketing representative will be in touch with you very quickly to talk about the next steps. So with that, thank you very much. I'll now hand over back to Darwin for the Q&A session.
Thank you, Shinji, for the very clear explanation. We have a few questions on the chat. So let me read to you these questions and we discuss as many of them until we run out of time. But if you have other questions, you can simply let us know and we can reply to them via email. So let me start with this question. What advantages do infraMetric physical risk metrics offer compared to what is already out there in the market?
Right. So I'll start by replying to the question. Darwin, feel free to add on if you have any more points to add. So one of the key differences between what we're offering right now versus existing physical risk metrics out there is that a lot of existing market physical risk metrics, they are ranking the assets from high to low. So very high physical risk, high physical risk all the way to very low physical risk, and they stop there. Oftentimes, they don't include even the magnitude of the event, like we do here. We have 1 in 100, 1 in 50, 1 in 30. They have only at high to low ranking of the assets. So while this is informative to tell you where your asset stands against others, it doesn't exactly cover what additional we offer, which is the ability to link it with financials and to quantify the actual estimated damage to the asset. So when you're able to quantify the actual estimated damage to the asset, you're able to quantify the financial value at risk, as well as the expected loss, and to do sector risk exposure. So this is what we offer in addition to what is out there in the market.
Thank you. Follow-up question. So in the presentation, you mentioned that you're covering flood, storms, and cyclones. Why considering this and no other assets, also other types of risks? Pardon.
Right. So yes, you caught on well. We currently only cover floods, storms, and cyclones. There is a good reason for that. Let me explain. It comes in two parts. So the first part is that based on a study released by the UN ODR, I think it stands for UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, based on a research that they do in 2020, it was found that storms and flood are the major climate change events that is happening in the world from a period of 2000 to 2019. So almost 2 decades. These are the key climate major events that's happening. And at the same point in time, during this 2-decade event, they recorded almost double increase in flood events during that time period and 40% increase in storms event during that time period. So these are the major physical risks that's affecting assets. Therefore, we decided to cover this first. And at the same time, because of the fact that these are the more relevant or more prominent physical risk, a lot of the existing research on damage functions actually center around this few physical risks too. There is actually very little information available for damage functions for other types of physical risk, such as wildfire or heat wave, for example. So we are limited by that, but of course we are constantly looking to expand our scope and work with research and do deeper research into this. And as mentioned before, we are actually adding heat stress into our coverage soon. We're currently working on that. And hopefully we will increase the coverage to even more physical risk in the future.
Very good. And related to that point, what kind of resolutions for flood, storm, and cyclones you have?
Right. Oh, so this is the question on the hazard model resolution.
Yeah.
So for flood, it is about 30 meters square worldwide in terms of the resolution. For storms, it is about 1 kilometer square. And for cyclones, it is about 11 kilometers square worldwide.
Very good. Do the physical risk metrics that you have presented integrate the effects of climate change?
Right. So to answer this question, the short answer is no. So this goes back to the explanation of how we calculate 1 in 100-year flood risk. So these are based on historical data, and they do not factor into account future prediction, which is the reason also why in the news nowadays, interestingly, we see a lot more mention of 1 in a 100-year flood happening more often, because of the fact that historically, these are based on older climate scenarios, and currently, due to global warming, it is happening more frequently. And a longer answer to the question is, however, we are planning to include that in the future. So yes, in the future, there are plans to include climate scenarios for physical risk, and this will come in the physical climate scenarios tab in infraMetrics. So how we intend to do that is we actually will factor into account 3 types of climate scenarios: RCP, which stands for Relative Carbon Pathway, if I recall correctly, RCP 2.6. Representative pathway. So RCP 2.6 is modeling a world where the temperature would have increased up to 2 degrees by the year 2100. And then we also have RCP 4.5, which is 3 degree by year 2100, and RCP 8.5, which is 5 degrees by the year 2100. So we intend to do our calculations on that, and we'll release it when we have all these available. Sorry, to add on to a point, if you'd like to know more about these climate scenarios work that we have done, please join us next week for the webinar by my colleagues Abhishek and Bertrand, who are the experts in this field, and they'll share more about what they are doing.
Yeah, thank you, Shinju. We still have a few more questions and we're running out of time. So I guess what we're gonna do is on separate emails, we're gonna send answers to some of these questions. Just gonna ask one final question. Can these physical risk metrics be used for regulatory reporting?
Right. So on regulatory reporting, as mentioned earlier, you can use it for TCFD, which actually requires physical risk inputs. So in the TCFD guideline on metrics, targets, and I think transition plan, they actually set out a long list of guidelines of what sort of physical risk information they need. So in particular, our metric fits in three major ways. So firstly, one of the requirements that TCFD encourages is for companies to disclose the proportion of asset that is being affected by flood, heat stress, as well as water stress. So we already provide flood and water stress. And then secondly, they also require they encourage companies to report how much of your proportion of asset that is affected by 1 in 100 as well as 1 in 200 physical risk events. So we already provide the 1 in 100 physical risk event that you can use directly as an input for that reporting. And then lastly, I think they also require you to report the increased cost of repair brought about due to this exposure to physical risk. So here you can use our P-bar value as an estimate, as a proxy for that requirement.
Thank you, Shinju. I guess we've reached the end of this webinar. Thank you everyone for your participation and questions. We want to invite you to join us to the next webinar, How to Use infraMetrics with Climate Scenarios. This is happening next week, next Thursday, April 20th. And we really hope to see you soon. Thank you, everyone.